Моя справа життя з 14 років захищати суверенітет України і український народ. Тому і роблю, бо можу. Кожен має вносити якийсь вклад і працювати на те, щоб ми зберегли державу і здобули перемогу в цьому проводі національному, який вже триває з моменту Переяславської ради. Від Сяну до Дону треба. Як Святослав Ігорович зробив, так і ми маємо це зробити. Є два шляхи. Або нас не буде, або ми будемо.
А що ви маєте на увазі, скільки нас не буде?
Вас, мене, українського народу.
А чому?
Ну, тому що задача, яка декларується противником, це знищення нашої державності як такової і нашої національної самосвідомості.
Thanks for the opportunity to comment on one of the most amazing maritime feats in years. So you put your finger right on it. Not only did Ukraine roll back the presence of the Black Sea Fleet, they don't even have a navy. They have given us all a view of a future where unmanned surface vehicles, basically sea drones, have the potential to wage conflict at a large scale against a traditional manned navy. Really remarkable. They have had some help from us, from our European allies, but I should stress that a great deal of their expertise is indigenous. It's grown with their own engineers, their own lessons learned.
Це перша, а друга «Сіві спасем парабелу».
Перекладіть, будь ласка.
Хочеш миру, готуйся до війни.
This is the largest case of missing children since World War II. Because the return of stolen children is such a sensitive matter, and because publicizing details about children who remain missing can endanger rescue efforts, we search for a symbolic way to tell their stories. That's why we chose a teddy bear, a universal symbol of childhood. Each teddy bear represents one child abducted by Russia, and there are 20,000 of them behind me. These are the children that we know were stolen. But how many others are there?
What Vladimir Putin is doing here is not trying to take territory alone. He's not trying to defeat a nation alone. He's trying to destroy a people. That is the purpose of abducting children, changing their names, re-educating them, killing their identities, if not the children themselves, making sure that they never grow up speaking their own language, knowing their own religion and culture. He is trying to destroy Ukraine in a way that harkens back to the 1930s and 1940s.
Finding 20,000 kids is not easy, and we are using modern technology with the Yale Lab and other places to track where they are.
I will take this teddy bear with me when I go back to Ukraine in May for my 11th trip. I will go back to Ukraine with this teddy bear, not just in my pocket, but in my heart, with the image of these bears.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all for attending this panel about Ukraine. And I want to thank my friend of more than 50 years, Vince Day, who's also the co-chair of the 50th reunion class, for suggesting that people would be interested in talking about Ukraine. I wish I could take a photograph of all of you here and send it to friends in Ukraine so they would know Americans have not abandoned Ukrainians. Americans still care deeply about what happens to their country. I've had the extraordinary opportunity to travel to Ukraine, and on the way to Ukraine and on the way home again, I've met these extraordinary people. Ben Goldhagen, who made one of the very first films about Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. It's called To the Zero Line. You can watch it for free online. And Ben also made the film The Steel Porcupine, which was an important policy presentation just about a year ago, Ben. Yeah. And next to Ben, my colleague from the Kyiv Post, Chuck Pfarrer, a former Navy SEAL and a military analyst, the best of all, bar none. He has taught me more about how to understand warfare, not a subject I really was interested in, but one I've learned about from necessity. His maps are meticulous. You can find them online at Indications and Warnings. And finally, Natty Raymond, who works here at Yale University at the Yale School of Public Health. He is the executive director of the Yale Humanitarian Research Project. It is thanks to Natty and his team, really a detective agency, that Maria Lvova-Belova and Vladimir Putin have been indicted as war criminals by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And it is precisely because of the systematic abduction of Ukrainian children. As you just heard, probably more than 20,000. Now, in about 60 minutes today, it will be a challenge. We're not going to do much history, but we want to be sure that all of you have an understanding of the current situation in Ukraine, and also to make time for questions. Your questions are probably the most important thing we can answer here today. But I want to begin by asking Ben, who's just recently returned from Ukraine, two questions. First, can you tell me a little bit about the short film we just saw, especially the opening? And second, what was the mood you found in Ukraine?
Well, the reason why this, well, I'll go backwards, because Natty's here and Chuck's here. I put this together so there'd be an introduction to a little bit of what they do, because Chuck is true, having been a Navy SEAL and knowing all about blowing things up in the water. He has been analyzing and keeping people abreast all around the world about what's going on with drone warfare and with other military things. And Natty, as Alan said, has been really one of the key people amongst many people, which he'd like to say. He doesn't like getting all the credit, with exposing a gulag archipelago of stolen children, which is part of a national campaign, the national project to use a word that is not a great word, genocide, or eliminate the Ukrainian people. And what got me into it, and the beginning of this, is my brother, who is well known in the field of genocide studies, or as he called eliminationism. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, after the initial failure of the first 3 days, the question was, what's going to happen next? And it was pretty clear from a historical perspective that the project was not about land alone, as Senator Blumenthal just said, but about the elimination of the Ukrainian people. And there are different methods of what people call genocide, and stealing of children is one of them. In the beginning of the film, why this one is here is that that's the European Bridge. And that was a pivotal moment in the war. It was blown up in the first, it's right outside of Kyiv. It's like a bridge. After that bridge, you get to Kyiv. And the Ukrainians blew that bridge up so that the Russians, that's how close they were to taking Kyiv. And they blew that bridge up so that it basically is a barrier. And then these were refugees that then crossed that bridge. And that was one of the aspects of the turning point militarily of the war that's led us now 4 years later. And the mood.
So the mood today is different than on that day from Irpin, isn't it?
Yeah. At the beginning there was just this mass desire to do something. There wasn't a panic like, oh my God, like we're finished. It was, we have to fight this thing. It was really much like the Minutemen here in New England. People took arms, and there were, for example, in Lviv, the government brought in a whole lot of rifles, like cases and case rifles. People picked them up. Later, after it wasn't a threat anymore, they had to bring the rifles back, and now I guess they're in storage. And so at first there was this whole beehive of activity, people were just trying to do something. Now 4 years later is what, and I've been going back to Ukraine making films all through this 4 years. Now the resolve is very great right now to keep fighting. And this is what the administrations and sometimes the Europeans don't understand, that they think that the Ukrainians will make a deal. But the Ukrainians, as Zelensky says, the deal, they don't want a pause in this genocidal campaign. They need to defeat the invader. And so the resolve is very great because they understand the threat, which we don't really fully understand in the West like they do. And they are fighting valiantly, innovating like the drones, which they didn't have an Air Force, they weren't getting the help. They now have an industrial base, and they are tired. They're tired of war, but they're not. They will prevail. And these people know much more about fighting than I do, and the nature of the conflict. And so I kind of leave it to you guys to talk about that. I document it, but I don't really understand it as well as they do.
I don't know about that, Ben. I do want to turn to Chuck Pfarrer, though, and ask a couple of military questions that require answers. I think it's said by military folks that nations' militaries don't win or lose the war with the army they entered the war with. How has the Russian invading army changed in 4.5 years, and how has the Ukrainian army changed in 4.5 years, and which, in your opinion, is going to be the winning army?
Well, there hasn't been a war in human history where someone hasn't pronounced it a revolution and a change forever in the way wars are being fought. Everyone says that. Russia came into this with overwhelming superiority in materiel, armor, air, everything you can imagine. By every mode of examination, Russia should have just rolled over Ukraine. So 4 years later, the second greatest army in the world, with the legacy of Soviet power, is now the second best army in Ukraine. Okay? So, and you heard the general saying that the Black Sea has been swept clear by the Ukrainian, remote control Romanian, Ukrainian unmanned surface vessels. They've defeated the flower of the Russian Navy, which was the Black Sea Fleet. They don't dare do anything in the Black Sea because the Ukrainians will hunt them down and kill them. And not only can Russia no longer project power, right? It kept its thumb on the middle of Europe and that section of the Middle East and the Bosphorus through the Black Sea Fleet since imperial times. Now they can't even protect their shadow fleet tankers. And I won't go too far into what has revolutionized this war, but 4 years ago, there was no such thing as a first-person drone. No such thing. And I've done work for DARPA, and I've done all that spooky stuff. I've worked for every letter in the alphabet soup. And I can tell you, if I came in 4 years ago to DARPA and I said, look, I took my son's drone and I taped this RPG warhead to it, and I can fly it into a tank. Raytheon would say, look, we already got something that does that, kid, for $280,000 a shot. That's what we need. We don't need this $1,000 toy. Okay, that toy has revolutionized warfare. It has changed the calculus of combined arms maneuver warfare. And I won't go into all the details, but I will tell you this. 95% of the Russian bodies that hit the dirt in Ukraine have been killed by a flying robot. Drones kill 95% of the invaders. Russia came in and their invasion plan was the best plan they had from 1982. Okay? It was the plan, and if anyone served in the military in the Cold War, we fully expected the Russians to come through the Fulda Gap and push the Allies, and I'm not kidding, all the way back to the English Channel. I know because the special operations I was briefed on at the very beginning of my career were hit the target and try to blend in with the scenery because the Russians are going to overrun you. Okay, the Russians are never going to win in Ukraine. And I'll wrap this up quickly from the military calculus. Because every day they lose 2 battalions of men, every day. 1,000 people every day. Every 10 days they lose a division of people, 10,000 people. Every year they lose 365,000 troops every year. Okay, that isn't a W, folks, that's an L. And the last thing I'll say is, the New York Times, they closed their bureau in Kyiv. BBC, they don't have a bureau in Kyiv. Go to the BBC after this thing and type in and look at the masthead, and it'll say United States and Canada, Europe, Asia, Africa, and it used to say war in Ukraine, but it doesn't even say that anymore. Okay, so I'm telling you, you're not getting the real picture of how the war is going. Okay, I'm still a long war guy. This isn't going to be over by Christmas, but it's no longer winnable for Russia.
Yesterday's casualties for the Russians were 1,490 killed and wounded. Ukraine has a very young military and Ministry of Defense. Zelensky has recently promoted folks in their 30s. It might well be the youngest military in the world, Chuck. We have Mikhailo Fedorov, who's 35, Kirillo Budanov, who's now the head of Zelensky's presidential office. He's 38, I think. We have the commander of the very first unmanned forces unit of the military in history, created by Ukraine. He's a former marketing and advertising guy, Robert Brovdy. I think he's 41, so he's quite elderly. And just recently, Zelensky promoted a number of field commanders, all in their 30s, to commanding generals in the field. And not to get sucked in by statistics, but in order for Russia to take less than 20% of Ukraine, which is about the size of Texas, by the way, they have expended anywhere from 250 killed and wounded per square kilometer to most recently, the number is looking better for the Russians lately, I think it's down to 67 Russians killed and wounded in order to occupy 1 square kilometer of Ukrainian land, often just an empty field. One other question for you, Chuck. The war has changed, I think, 3 times, beginning with a defensive war that the Ukrainians fought, and they made a decision not to engage directly with the invading Russian forces. And then an attritional war, which we saw unfold in Bakhmut and most recently in Pokrovsk, and which has unfolded really all along the eastern and southern front primarily. And now I wonder if you agree with me, the war has become a war of innovation and invention. Who is going to out-innovate the other in this war?
Well, without any exaggeration, you could say that Ukraine was the brains of the Soviet Union, right? Ukraine built their Blue Water Navy. They were built in the Mykolaiv shipyards on the Black Sea. Their space and intercontinental ballistic missile programs, the Ukrainians were the brains of that. Their nuclear weapons and nuclear power generation, again, it was Ukrainian brains that did that. So coming into this war, let's talk about it I think we're in the 4th quarter. The 1st quarter didn't go really very well. And I'll remind everybody, Ukraine was compelled to go to the negotiation table, and did. Of course, the Russians didn't want to hear anything about it. Improbably, the greatest force that Russia could field, their flower of their paratroop forces, their special operations, they all went in to seize the airfield at Hostomel, which is just north of Kyiv. These guys, some of them had dress uniforms in their backpacks to get ready for the victory parade. I don't think so. Anyway, they were defeated at the Hostomel airport by 2 companies, not battalions, 2 companies of National Guard guys, dentists, lawyers, mechanics, carpenters. That invasion and actualizing, grabbing Hostomel airport was the stepping stone to taking the capital of Kyiv. Remarkably, they were defeated there. Okay, that's Q1. People will tell you, some of them, and if Jake Sullivan is here, please step up because I have a punch in the nose for you. Some people will tell you, look, the Ukrainians can never beat the Russians. Well, they've been beating them since the end of the 1st quarter. Okay, here's some things you might not have heard of. Ukrainian counterattack in Kherson Oblast drove the Russians over the Dnipro River and into Kherson Oblast. Didn't hear about that? You wouldn't hear about it from the BBC. Sumy Oblast in the north. The Ukrainians pushed the Russians back over the frontier. In their tens of thousands drove them out. The attack on Kyiv, they pushed the Russians back in such disarray that they rioted, ran amok, committed atrocities like you couldn't believe in Bucha, and every one of them was driven back into Belarus. I'm not done. The Kharkiv offensive, they pushed the Russians back as much as 60 kilometers a day. The 1st Guards Tank Army, which you see on Red Square, goose-stepping, they ceased to exist. They left their tanks behind, which have now been painted with Ukrainian rondelles. Okay, this war is, so now we're at halftime. It was still a toss-up. But this war now is no longer winnable by Russia. That was my 3rd quarter assessment. Now it's losable by Russia because they have hollowed out their army, right? Their logistics, they went into logistics and said, we don't need anybody to drive trucks. Everyone gets a rifle, you go to Bakhmut. Now they don't have any logisticians. They don't have any trucks. There are donkeys delivering arms and ammunition and food to Russian frontline troops. I said donkeys, right? There are Russians patrolling on horseback because they don't have vehicles. Putin says he's going to nuke whatever. Really? So here's why that calculus doesn't work. If he fires an intercontinental ballistic from Yavuz Yar and it's up in the air, Paris has 2 minutes to figure out if that nuke is going to hit Paris. 2 minutes. That is not how you extend your political future, is it? So that isn't going to happen. That's off the table, which is why Mr. Sullivan and I need to talk. That was always a hollow threat. 5 latest tests Russian ballistic missiles. 3 of them exploded. In the air, their biggest success, it exploded on the ground and made a crater you could see from outer space, right? They are at their wits' end completely. So we're going to see eventually those same Ukrainian offensives. You know, people say they can't do it. Well, they've already done it 4 times. And they'll be able to do it because the Russian soldiers who are coming to the front, you get recruited in Moscow, you're put on a bus, 6 days later you show up outside Bakhmut and you're in combat. Okay, so I want you to imagine, I just handed any one of you here, I'll give you an AK-47, I'll give you a 6-day bus ride. Are you ready to fight the Ukrainian army? Are you ready to hear that sound of a drone circling over your head? That's why they lose 1,000 people a day and 1,500. So I've just given you Alan and I have literally toured the zero line all 2,500 kilometers. We have been everywhere and looked at everything. And in my considered, look, I'm a door kicker. Like I'm not a war college guy, but I can tell you this war is no longer winnable for Russia, right? 2 people are in an existential fight, Ukraine and Vladimir Putin. His idea, right? 72-hour military operation. You will go to prison in Russia if you call it a war.
And so through Ben's documentary lens and through Chuck's military analysis, we really get to the heart of the matter, I feel, and that's the abducted Ukrainian children. President Zelensky has said there can be no resolution of this war without a just resolution of the war, which means finding and returning more than 20,000 Ukrainian children who have been abducted. The person who runs the detective agency, and that's what it is, and it has to be one of the most remarkable detective stories in history to find these children, is right here at the end of the table. It's Natty Raymond. It's his team that does the work. And Natty gets to talk about it, I guess. But Natty, how did the likelihood, the probability of the Russians abducting Ukrainian children and therefore committing a war crime, a genocidal crime, so identified in the convention, how did this possibility come to your attention?
So the Yale School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab, we were contracted in the summer of 2022 by the U.S. State Department's Conflict Stabilization Operations Bureau to use very high-resolution satellite imagery and open-source intelligence methods to basically document Russia's alleged war crimes as they were occurring, to be basically the main evidence conduit between the U.S. government and the International Criminal Court. And so we were given a tasker, an order by the State Department in the summer of 2022 to track down reports that kids were being taken in groups and to basically conduct our own assessment to share with the U.S. National Intelligence Council and the National Security Council as to what we could find about scale, scope, and motive. And so when I got that assignment, we were very depressed because we thought it was technically impossible, given the methods we had. And then we had a breakthrough, which was, in the parlance of intelligence, a tradecraft failure by the Russians, a spectacular tradecraft failure, which is what happened is the local mayors in the towns that the kids were taken to were taking selfies of themselves with the kids when they got off the bus, and they left their location settings on their phones on. And so we started scraping the metadata from their Telegram social media accounts, and they were giving us the latitude and longitude locations of the kids. And so then we started using basically U.S. commercial satellites to surveil the latitude and longitude of the locations where the buses were going to. And then we began to, the big problem we had is I'm going to get very technical here, and I apologize. The big problem we had is that Russian GRU, so their version of the National Security Agency, had put burglar traps inside Russian cyberspace to detect us. And so we began to have to, there's some things I technically can't say, but we had to infiltrate Russian cyberspace without using a VPN. And so without using a very private network, because they had set up an alarm system to detect VPN for the New York Times, for different law enforcement intelligence services. And so we basically realized by the late fall, early winter of 2022 that they knew we were coming and that they were starting to move the kids from the locations under surveillance. And so we brought everyone, and I can say this now, I know you're recording this, so NPR, it was the only time a journalist had ever seen our team because we were constantly being surveilled by Russian intelligence, that we brought everyone to Yale. Though they're Yale personnel, they don't live at Yale, they're scattered around. And we went to a basement in a certain library, you can probably figure out where it was, and NPR came and recorded the sound of the steps, walking down the steps all the way down. And we came to this meeting, and NPR was able to see it, but they couldn't record the voices of the analysts. And we had to make a decision to release our count on the kids, knowing that if we released count on locations and counted the number of the kids we had figured out through Russian sources online, that the Russians were going to start blowing the data sources up. And they were going to move the kids. They were already moving the kids. We could detect the kids were in motion. And so we did a go, no-go decision, like in NASA, where we asked each team member, if you were a Ukrainian parent and knew, based on releasing this report now, there were some kids who would never come home because we released this report now, and they would be taken further into Russia, would you do it? And we went, yes, yes, yes. We had to make a horrible decision knowing that we were probably closing the door on some of these kids ever coming home. And so we made that call. We released the report, and 1 month later, 4 weeks, we released on Valentine's Day 2023, and 4 weeks later, ICC indicted. And so then we began to realize, and I will shut up in a second, that the Russians were hiding orphans in their national adoption database as if they were Russian children. And so our next assignment after that was to infiltrate that database and to figure out which kids were in fact Ukrainian, being masqueraded or being deceptively hidden as Russians.
It's actually, I think, a very difficult thing to speak about, frankly. I don't know how Natty does his job every day.
Mostly disassociation.
Okay. Are Russians continuing to abduct Ukrainian children?
No, not at scale. I can't say definitively no. They are mostly focused in the occupied areas on forcing passports, so passportization, to force children that are still with their families to become Russian citizens. But they are using the children in the Ukrainian count is about 19,500 to 20,000. We think our estimate that we're going to hopefully validate in time for UN General Assembly in October is 35,000. We think it's 35,000 in 4 groups. Kids who are in camps, kids who were taken from institutions and put in adoption and fostering, kids who were taken from the battlefield, primarily Mariupol, in 2022, and kids who were taken directly from their parents when their parents were sent to interrogation in what was called the filtration camps, which are basically concentration camps from the first part of the war. And so what is happening now is the Russians are using the kids they have as bargaining chips in the negotiation with the Ukrainians. So our fear from the beginning was that these kids were going to be used as hostages. And so they went from propaganda value, and now basically, they're kids with almost literally gun to their head, and they're in 210 facilities, many of them, where they're being militarized, probably to be sent to combat against their own country, though we're working to confirm that.
I think this is one of the things about the Russian invasion of Ukraine that does need to be talked about. Russia has fought a number of different kinds of wars against Ukraine, not only a diplomatic war and not only a military war, but a war of disinformation and propaganda. Russia spends over $1 billion annually to convince the world that it is really a good nation, that it wouldn't do anything as reprehensible as committing genocide or war crimes against a peaceful neighbor. I wonder, Natty, if you could just explain as briefly as possible the standard of evidence that your team needs to meet in order for the ICC to accept it and weigh it in trial, because war criminals may well come to trial in The Hague.
So it's important to say that Yale was critical for all 6 indictments on Ukraine, 2 on the kids, 4 on attacks on power generation infrastructure, including Gerasimov and Shoigu, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Minister of Defense for crimes against humanity. So in all 6 indictments that we contributed to, we had to basically do 4 things. One is in the case, well, I'll be specific on the kids. In the case of the kids, we had to identify real persons, meaning that we couldn't just say that a crime had occurred. We had to identify the victims and validate basically the name, the social identity number, the whole dossier on not all the kids, but enough kids to be probative. And if there's any lawyers in the room, probative means evidence that a crime has been committed, allegedly. The second thing we had to do is to preserve the digital information with chain of custody. And that was the most important thing. And when our funding was cut by the Trump administration last year, and you can read about it in the Washington Post story, there was one day where suddenly our database, our archive of the chain of custody of the evidence for court, including for Europol, for Department of Justice, for the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, just disappeared. The Trump administration just turned it off. And I literally called someone, said, dude, where's my data? And we didn't know where and this wasn't just the kids' case, this was 13 giant repositories across multiple cases, including related to DOJ support on Bucha homicides. And so luckily we found a copy, but they just turned it off. And so what was so devastating about that is the entire chain of custody of that evidence repository was endangered. The third thing we have to be able to do is to ensure the geolocation of the data. And that's where satellites become really important. And the fourth thing is basically making sure that individual kids, right, to chain of custody standard, that is geo and chrono located, time and place located. The fourth thing, that it basically meets a standard of dispositivity. And so that means that we use a 5-source standard. So for every piece we've submitted to ICC, we have 5 pieces of cross-corroboration.
That's important. And, to answer your question, Natty, if there are any lawyers in the audience, come on, it's Yale.
Yeah.
What are the chances?
Some expected to be on the Supreme Court. We will open the floor to your questions in just a moment, but I also want to mention briefly Natty's investigation of a crime was threatened by what I would also call a crime, turning off the database without any warning. Natty's project was primarily funded by USAID, which...
Actually, no, it was state.
By state?
By state.
Okay.
And through the National Defense Authorization Act.
So not through USAID?
No.
Okay.
Nope.
Thank you for that correction. But you have survived on private donations, right?
Yeah. And thank you, Yale alums. At the end of the day, it was angry American grandmothers and Yale alumni who have kept us alive for 19 months. We've been on month-to-month termination since end of 2024, since the election. And without Yaleys, we'd be dead.
So thanks, Yale alumni. We raised money for Natty's organization on Volya Radio, which is a Twitter space where I'm an occasional co-host. And you can go to the Volya Radio Spotify archive and find 2 interviews with Natty and a 3rd interview with one other member of his team, Paige
Fahrenkopf.
Fahrenkopf, thank you. And it's worthwhile doing that because you can also find a link to the Yale School of Public Health in order to make a donation. And the university will recognize you for that donation. I made a donation in the memory of my mother and father, and it had a very nice thank you note from the Yale president. So here's an opportunity for each and every one of you to stand up for Ukraine, and to stand up for what Yale can do too.
Bulla bulla.
And so I said we'd do this in 60 minutes or so, because there is another presentation following ours, and I would like to open the discussion to questions, and I am glad to see all these questions here. I'll start from the right, please. Jim, I happen to recognize you, right? Jim Kramer. Yell your question as loud as you can.
I'll do my best. I've been following this for a long time. My first question is about the state of support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian military now. Because I agree with Shah that with Sullivan, I'll hold him while you get him. Because it certainly seemed under Biden that the message was, we're behind you 62%. And that if they'd only taken it farther than that, this could have probably been over a long time ago.
Can I start with that? Can I answer this for 1 second?
Yeah.
But now that we've completely turned our backs on them and stopped supporting them, to the degree that you know, where are they getting the support from, Europe or wherever else, and how is it doing?
Can I just say something? Absolutely.
Well, I just want to add something. These people know more about this than I do when it comes to the numbers. But in 2022, I was in Bakhmut during Wagner. And so we were hearing here in the West, we'll, as long as it takes, we're going to send all these weapons. And as a filmmaker, I was with the 24th Brigade, and I said to the press officer, I want to film Western weapons and hear what a game changer it is for the guys. And because that's what we've been telling, what was happening. And he said, we don't have any. And I said, what do you mean you don't have any? And he said, well, I think we have a Barrett, which is a sniper rifle. He said, do you want to film the Barrett? And I said, no, that's not the point.
You can buy one, by the way, at Sears, pretty much. A Barrett is not a game changer.
Yeah, and so that's when I knew, being on the ground, that we were being lied to here, really, basically. We were being deceived. And I came back and told people this, and many people didn't believe me at that time. But we know differently now, so.
Well, one of the countries that stepped up incredibly, the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Poles, basically Europe. You know, what's amazing about this war is I didn't think Putin would invade because NATO had become the Lions Club without the dance band, right? It was nothing. He defibrillated NATO, right? They rose from the dead. So we've got lots of support coming. Not lots. They need everything. They need bullets. They need Band-Aids, beans, air defense. There's nothing that they don't need. Europe has stepped up, but I do want to hit on what you said. Anyone take a wild guess? Remember we said, well, we're not going to give them F-16s. Then we said to Belgium, how dare you give them 70? We're going to kick you out of NATO. Okay. Finally, okay, F-16s are showing up, and they are finally in combat. Guess how many pilots we've trained? Jake Sullivan was telling you, well, we're engaging in training Ukrainian pilots. How many do you think? 2. They sent them to Top Gun, though, right? No, they sent them to a National Guard base in Arizona. So Washington will take the victory lap, announce that, what was it, 500 Abrams.
Well, Ukraine requested 500 Abrams and 31 were delivered.
31. So you see the headline, but you don't see the retraction. And I'll add one other thing. It's so much worse than you know. Okay, Ukraine caught the Russians napping and actually invaded Russia. They invaded Kursk Oblast, where they sent in 10,000 North Koreans to kick the Ukrainians out. Ukraine killed 6,000 of them and 2 of their generals. Then the Ukrainian salient collapsed in Kursk. And can you take a wild guess why? Washington pulled the plug on all of the intelligence that was going to Ukraine. Nothing. No overhead imagery, no electronics intelligence, nothing. And that salient collapsed. I'm not a geopolitics guy. Like I said, I'm a door kicker. But it seems like, why did Putin get the gift there? Because that's what it was. It was a gift. It was a gift.
If you don't mind me saying, because they've been more or less left on their own with some support, that has been a silver lining for them to become innovators. And without an air, like the general said, General Cavoli and Chuck, they have no navy, but they sunk a significant portion of the Russian Navy because they created sea drones, this entire new category of fighting. And the same with, they are, the world experts now in drone warfare. So much so, I don't want to get too political, but Donald Trump's son and Witkoff's son have formed a company that have acquired some Ukrainian drone companies and are selling them to the Middle East now. So that's how good they are.
And just a word about numbers, and we'll take more questions. The United States can produce about 100,000 drones currently, annually. Ukraine will manufacture between 7 million and 10 million drones this year of all kinds. FPV drones, which are the small killer drones on the battlefield. Heavy lift drones, which carry logistical supplies to the front line, food, medical supplies, bullets, Band-Aids, etc. They also are used to lay mines behind the lines. And then, of course, the sea drones, and now ground drones, robots, Ukrainian robots, unassisted by Ukrainian infantry, have taken Russian soldiers captive. So just imagine that. You are surrendering to a machine. Happens to be equipped with a pretty good machine gun, Chuck, I think.
Yeah, but it's like surrendering to a 1963 Volkswagen. Okay? So that is the state of Russian morale, right? They're not, look, this isn't going to be a W.
And there are more hands. I'll keep from the right. Yes?
Description of these phases and where we are in a macro sense
Yeah, here's the targeting paradigm. Russia targets apartment buildings. That's what they're aiming at. If you can hit a children's chemotherapy ward, you get extra points, and I'm not exaggerating. A KH-101 cruise missile hit the chemo treatment room in a Kyiv hospital 10 stories up. Okay, it's great that Russia announces all these drone attacks, and they are frightening and horrible. But the math has evolved something like this. Somewhere between 85 and 90% of the Shahed Iranian-designed murder drones get intercepted or diverted. That's pretty good. But that 10% that comes through is going to hit apartment buildings. The second level you have are air-launched and sea-launched, even sub-sea-launched cruise missiles, and about somewhere between 80 and 90, but more often about 70% of those are intercepted. But again, you got 500 pounds of C4 and it's hitting an apartment building. That's bad. Here's a very interesting development, though. Putin likes to advertise the Kinzhal missile as his hypersonic gizmo. It's the starter kit for a hypersonic weapon, right? Hypersonic means like Mach 12. When we work on a hypersonic missile, it means it can maneuver at 12 times the speed of sound. And that's pretty hard because the G-forces are measured in the hundreds, right? So the Kinzhal is actually an aeroballistic missile, a ballistic missile that you drop from an airplane now. And it comes in at Mach 12. But there's a new electronic warfare device that Ukraine is using called Lima. And 95% of the Kinzhals are now being diverted away from their targets. The latest addition was the Orshirik, literally an intermediate range intercontinental ballistic missile falling with its warhead sections, the MIRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. Not only did it divert it, but you go back and watch the film of you can see the warheads coming in. Now they are unarmed, but they're flying at 15 times the speed of sound, so the kinetic shock is amazing. But you'll notice these things come down in groups of 4 or 5. One is a warhead, the rest are decoys. This thing was so kerfluffled by the electronic warfare that the decoys and the warheads came down in a single straight line, one after another, not feathering out and being decoys, and they all hit a garage outside of the city limits of Kyiv. No accident. That was his best weapon, right? But the problem is 8, 6, 7% come in and they're killing civilians in their beds.
Chuck and I have often talked about what the Russian military will choose to do as its summer campaign is frustrated increasingly by Ukrainian defensive maneuvers. And it is a primarily defensive war for Ukraine. So the more frustrated the Russian military gets, the more it ramps up its terror war on Ukrainian civilians. And this is one reason why they launched this massive attack against Kyiv. And not only over one night, but it was an attack that went on for almost 48 hours with hundreds or thousands of drones, I think, and 90 ballistic missiles launched primarily at Kyiv. One thing I do want to say, Kyiv is a big city with 3.5 million people. You can feel relatively safe in Kyiv. There's plenty of air raid shelter. Mm-hmm. You can go to some of the deepest metro tunnels in the world, or you can watch what's coming in from the roof of your hotel or from the street corner or from the fire escape. And I think we've done all of those things. Yeah. Another question right here, please. Yeah.
I'm curious about the intervention of Russell, because the most important thing is, didn't he close down one Starlink for the Ukrainians? Now I understand he's closed down for the Russians, so I don't understand what his motivation is, being him, why he would do that. And I would like the reaction of the panel to the reports of
Well, I think at one point he was saying, yes. Yeah, regarding Musk and the Starlink and et cetera, and I don't want to hog the microphone, but I will say this. He was saying things like, well, we don't know who owns them. I can't go turning off willy-nilly every Starlink. If you didn't pay Wednesday's bill, do you think you'd still have Starlink on Thursday? Would he be like, okay, well, one of the, then he threw a party for himself because he turned off the Starlinks. But first he turned them off for Ukraine, and then finally, listen, folks, South Africans love Russians, okay? They don't want to tell you that, but they do. And he finally turned off the Russian Starlinks, and it was a catastrophe for the Russians. Finally, 4 years into the war. So I'm not a big Musk fan myself.
But in terms of relying on Musk, there's simply no telling. But Ukraine does rely on Starlinks increasingly, and Ukraine is putting Starlinks on longer and longer range drones and using that in order to evade electronic warfare. And I know we have only a couple of minutes to go, and so I'm going to stay in the front with.
Thank you very much. You guys have been amazing. This is not my area of expertise, so thank you very, very much. I think from probably everyone here. Not to divert attention, but I can't help seeing the parallels between what you're saying and the U.S. and Iran and Arab arsenal and what you're talking about in terms of Russia getting devastated and insane people like Musk and insane people like Trump. So could you talk for a second about any parallels you see? Are we still in the first quarter with Iran and what might we expect?
I'm going to give Natty a geopolitical thing here.
Well, so what is the war in Ukraine about? The war in Ukraine, I'm going to bring this back to Iran. It's actually about the future of normative frameworks. It's about we are in the midst of the Third World War, and it's a fight over whether there will be international law and international systems. The issue in Iran is that the U.S. has engaged in a war that violates fundamental elements of international law and elements of the laws of armed conflict. I say that because fundamentally I'm just a war crimes investigator, so I call it like I see it. Really, the most critical weapon system, we talk about drones, the most critical weapon system is our values. In the United States, not just in this current administration, but in the Biden administration, which I served under, has either dismembered our values or not fully utilized our values and has equivocated in defense of our values. The failure to end the war in Ukraine is because we did not deploy our most important weapon system, which is our conviction morally. And that's why we are where we are. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but in the case of Iran, I'll leave it to Chuck to talk about how strategically dumb it was.
Yeah, I'm not going to say this very long, but I do want to. This will probably scare you. This is not a question of whether or not Iran has the bomb. So put your hand up and tell me, was it 10 or 15 years ago that you heard Iran was 6 months away from having a bomb? Okay, well, look, a junior at Stanford can tell you how a fission weapon works, right? You can literally go on Wikipedia and get a pretty good idea of the masses required. Okay, I worked in counterproliferation. I didn't get to say this out loud, but I'm no longer working for Uncle Sam. Iran is a covertly armed nuclear power. Well, there's never been one. Well, the Republic of South Africa was a covertly armed nuclear power. Pakistan was a covertly armed nuclear power until our former employers went, wow, what do you know? They just detonated a hydrogen bomb. India was a covertly armed nuclear power. Saudi Arabia is a covertly armed nuclear power. Why am I saying that? They paid for the Pakistani program. All that money to Dr. Khan came from Saudi Arabia. There are 5 ballistic missile sites manned by Chinese officers in Saudi Arabia, and they only have missiles that fire with a 20-mile circular error probable. They are totally useless as conventional weapons. Okay, so if you don't have to believe me, but just pretend that's the case right now. There we go. Okay, and I'm not making a judgment about Sunni or Shia, but when your national policy is to bring about the return of the occulted 12th Imam and predicate the end times, the same Christian end times that Billy Graham is talking about, it's a 100% overlap. You've got something to worry about. It isn't just theocracy, it is almost a death cult. And I have fought Hezbollah and their proxies all over the world. I don't need to remind you of the atrocities, the embassy bombings. The Marine barracks in Beirut, I was there, I survived the bombing. Okay? I fought Hezbollah throughout Lebanon. They're not good guys. They tore Syria apart. Okay, and I'm with Natty. I'm not taking a side in any war, but I'll just say that and do a little research and see how crazy I am. Maybe I am crazy, but this is something the government's not telling you, but I've written these papers and send them up, and they didn't chop my head off. So I'm sorry to have taken that time, but
Vince, I have a few more hands. What do you want me to do?
I hear you saying that the questions can't win, but it's hard to look at it and think it's not largely a stalemate in some places. My understanding is the Ukrainians have had 20% of their land occupied by the Russians. Is there realistic hope that the Ukrainians can expel the Russians from all the land they have?
Well, I would say yes. And I'll quickly go to Chuck, but I think he will agree with me. Yes, there is hope that Ukraine could expel all the Russian soldiers from all of Ukraine. It could be done if Ukraine is adequately armed by its friends and allies. The EU has stepped up and now is really completely replacing United States military aid to Ukraine. Sweden will be sending Gripen jet fighters to Ukraine. France will be sending jet fighters to Ukraine as well. Ukraine's Air Force will improve. Ukraine is out innovating Russia, and Ukraine has pursued a military strategy with more than one prong in it, a defensive attritional battle along the front line, deep strikes against Russia's oil refining capacity and energy economy. I think as much as 40 or 50% now of the oil revenue that goes to Russia to fund the war has been cut out. And finally, the third thing that Ukraine is doing, again with remarkable success, is destroying Russian logistics that now increasingly close to the front line. So Russian soldiers this summer and early fall will not be getting the supplies they need to fight a war. They will be so weak. Ukraine is sure to find a weak spot somewhere and take advantage of it, and one can always hope that this Russian army will simply desert the way the Russian army in World War I deserted.
Yeah, Natty's got some interesting. Well, this isn't his opinion. These are the specs right now.
The Russians control less territory now than they did prior to the full-scale invasion. So just to put that in perspective, with the 2014 incursions at 2022, January 2022, they had more land than they do now. And so really the critical question is about whether Ukraine is forced into a devil's deal that trades one of three things, or all of three things: land, kids, and defense guarantees. And so, but Ukraine, I can tell you, by being at part of the support in the negotiations, and having been with the international community in Montreal as part of this, the Ukrainians will never trade the kids, ever. They're ever. And they will never trade about 1 square foot of Ukrainian soil, and they'll never trade the kids. So if the Trump administration believes that that's going to happen, good luck, because they won't.
You know, there's just, it's very easy to be black and white about this, who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. Russia is kicking our butt in informational warfare. You are all highly educated and aware people who watch the news, and I bet 90% of what we're saying to you was a complete news break. So you've got at least 30,000 children who have been kidnapped. A great portion of those are scattered through cities in the Russian Arctic and Siberia. And God knows how many of them are homeless. I'll put
Some
up
closer to Japan than to Kyiv.
Absolutely. And just one other thing.
Includes North Korea, right?
And North Korea.
Yeah, that's debatable.
Okay.
So if you want to know who the bad guys are, there's an ongoing chemical weapons threat that Ukrainian soldiers face every day. They carry gas masks. We were talking with Yuri, who is the medical director of, I can't remember the brigade number now.
I think it was the 57th.
57th Brigade, a surgeon and physician who was in Kherson when it was taken. They were rounding up all the doctors. He was hidden by the local people in cellars for the whole period of the Ukrainian, for the occupation of Kherson. He was a pacifist by his own agreement, by his own thing. As soon as the Russians left, he joined the Ukrainian army and as a battlefield surgeon. He told Alan and I that every day he treats chemical casualties among the men he cares for. Not just tear gas, not just chloropectin, right? He's treated guys for organophosphate poisoning. That's insecticide. Nerve gases were designed, they were experimental failures in insecticide research. Taubman, GB, these were Nazi nerve gases. They've used nerve gas on the battlefield. If you go to the Kyiv Post, I've reported on it 3 times. So they're just video clips, you can watch it. You got dates, times, receipts from the UN, and like Natty, this has been completely investigated. No one hears about it. Nobody hears about it.
I think I need to close the session because there is another presentation following ours. I just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your 50th reunion celebration to listen to us talk a little bit about Ukraine. There's much more we can say, and you can find us all online saying much more. I encourage you to watch To the Zero Line and The Steel Porcupine, 2 films by Ben Goldhagen. I encourage you to follow Chuck Pfarrer at the Kyiv Post, on YouTube, on Twitter. I encourage you to follow Natty Raymond on Twitter and to follow the news about the Ukrainian children. And just in closing, I want to say no one wants the war to end more than Ukrainians. And I've never met anyone in Ukraine who is under any illusions about what this war is about or about what the cost of defending their families and homes will be. A remarkable people. If you want to escape the confusion of America, if you think the United States is confused in some ways, go to Ukraine and you will meet people with extraordinary clarity of purpose, clarity of life, clarity of standing up for one another and protecting one another. And everybody, I think, can learn and benefit from that clarity. So I want to thank all of you. As I say, I would like to send a photograph of you all to Ukraine so they know that America has not abandoned them. And I want to thank Ben and Chuck and Natty for accepting my invitation to be on this panel. Slava Ukraini.
Heroям slava.